The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. I'm speaking to you today in Jerusalem in front of the old city walls. We're on the western side of the old city, and behind me you can see the Jaffa Gate. On May the 8th of this year, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made political history when he negotiated a political alliance between two rival parties, Likud and Kadima, in a coalition reminiscent of the unity government Prime Minister Levi Eshkol formed just before the Six-Day War in 1967. Now, this strong coalition certainly gives Netanyahu more freedom to maneuver without fear of government collapse or having to call for new elections. Some have suggested this new alliance might give Netanyahu the latitude he needs to strike Iran's nuclear facilities unilaterally. Let me read to you what Charles Krauthammer wrote back on May the 10th. He said, "For Israelis today, it is May 1967. The dread is not quite as acute. The mood is not despair, just foreboding. Time is running out, but not quite as fast. War is not 4 days away, but it looms." He wrote, "Israelis today face the greatest threat to their existence. Apocalyptic mullahs publicly pledged to Israel's annihilation, acquiring nuclear weapons since May 1967. The world is again telling Israelis to do nothing as it looks for a way out. But if such a way is not found, as in 1967, Israelis know they will once again have to defend themselves by themselves. Israel is indeed alone and worried, and it has good reason to be. On the one hand, Iran's quest for nuclear weapons is nearing the finish line, and that will be a massive, game-changing moment for this world. As Netanyahu recently told Time magazine, it could be the first time we have a nuclear player who will not necessarily play by the rules. All the previous nuclear powers have been careful. This is the greatest threat, not just to Israel and the Middle East, but to civilization." He said, "You don't know how they will behave." Now, besides Iran getting the bomb, the other great game-changing event that is happening right now is the radicalization of Egypt, something we told you about for many, many years. We've been saying this really since way back in the mid-1990s. We've talked about the fall of Mubarak's regime. I'll just give you a brief quote from my father, something that he wrote back in 1993. This is almost 20 years ago. He said, "Islamic extremism is gaining power at a frightening pace in Egypt." And he refers to this prophecy in Daniel 11:42, which we'll go to in just a minute. But he said how that prophecy indicates Egypt will be allied with the king of the south. He said, "I believe this prophecy in Daniel 11:42 indicates you are about to see a radical change in Egyptian politics." Now, we'll look at that prophecy, as I said, in just a moment. And just to summarize what the Bible teaches, it talks about a king of the south, which, as we've said for so many, many years, is radical Islam headed by Iran. And then it talks about the king of the north in Daniel chapter 11. And that's referring to the European beast power, which is headed by Germany. But coming back to Egypt and what's happening, or what has been happening over the last year or so, you can clearly see today that it's turning radical. And as I say, we predicted that well over 15 years ago. Look at Egypt today. Look at what's happened in just the last few months. In just a few days, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate in Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, will square off against Ahmed Shafiq in the election runoff. And based upon campaign speeches, if Morsi wins, Egypt's new capital will be Jerusalem, not Cairo, Jerusalem. That's what this candidate for Egypt's president wants. He wants the capital to be right here in Jerusalem. One of Morsi's political advisors recently said, "Our capital shall not be Cairo, Mecca, or Medina. It shall be Jerusalem with God's will." He said, "Our chance shall be millions of martyrs will march toward Jerusalem. Now, the video of that speech was posted on YouTube just a few weeks ago, and it immediately went viral, posting tens of thousands of views to YouTube within hours. It said, "The United States of the Arabs will be restored on the hands of that man," he referred to Morsi, "and his supporters." He went on to say, "The capital of the Muslim Caliphate will be Jerusalem with God's will." That was from, again, a cleric who advises this candidate in the Egyptian elections. He said, "Yes, we will either pray in Jerusalem or we will be martyred there." Let's turn over to Zechariah 14 just to begin with here today. Now you see all of these events happening, swirling around Jerusalem really, and it doesn't look good for Israel, as I said at the start. I mean, they're very much alone, and they've got enemies pushing at them from every direction now. And we've talked here just briefly about the two big ones coming from Iran and Egypt, but you can add to that Hamas and Lebanon with Hezbollah, and on and on and on it seems to go. So it doesn't look good, as I say, but the exciting thing is everything that we see happening is unfolding exactly the way God said that it would. Zechariah chapter 14 here, and we'll look at verse 1. It says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, and your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken," it says, "and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." So here Zechariah gives us the big overview of events leading to the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. You can see that that's referred to if you continue reading in that chapter. Look at verse 4. You can check that out later on your own time. But just to focus on these first two verses, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Firstly, for I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle." Now this refers to when Jesus Christ will gather the armies of this world just before he returns to the Mount of Olives, which is really just beyond these old city walls on the other side in eastern Jerusalem. So that's the culminating event. But before that happens, as this prophecy points out, it also says, "The city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished." Now this refers to the king of the north, when it brings its armies into this city. The king of the north, that beast power coming from Europe, which will bring in its armies to conquer Jerusalem. Shortly after, he conquers the king of the south. We'll get to that when we go over to Daniel 11 in just a second. But to finish off the thought here in Zechariah 14, before that happens, you'll notice there in verse 2 that it says, "Half the city," speaking of Jerusalem here, "half the city shall go forth into captivity." And of course, this is referring to the Palestinians taking control of half the city of Jerusalem. I mean, right now you could pretty much say that the city is divided, certainly along those ethnic lines, but the Jewish state certainly controls all of the city of Jerusalem. But that's about to change. Your Bible says that that will change. And this too is something that we have been forecasting for many, many years. We've been telling you, for this reason, to watch Jerusalem. We've been telling you this for years because what happens here in this city will trigger a series of events that will culminate in the return of Jesus Christ. As I said, continue reading through the rest of that chapter in Zechariah. It talks about when Jesus Christ sets foot on the Mount of Olives. That's the event that this is leading to. But before all of that, as I said, this city of Jerusalem will be divided, and it will be divided by force. Now, Zechariah's prophecy implies that it is Jerusalem, specifically the Temple Mount area, which is within this old city, specifically that Temple Mount area, it's that stands between any kind of peaceful arrangement to exist between the Jews and the Palestinians. That's the one obstacle that neither side can get by. And because of that, eventually, the Palestinians will attempt to resolve the impasse by taking matters into their own hands and grabbing hold of East Jerusalem by force. Hosea chapter 5, let's just spin over to this prophecy, Hosea chapter 5. There was another story recently in the news about an economic agreement that's being discussed between Israel and the Vatican, and the wording of the document that they were putting together, it had to do with the sites around here that the Catholic Church considers to be holy. And so they've been working on this arrangement for many years with Israel, and the most recent wording of that agreement that came out angered a lot of the Palestinians, because it makes it seem like the Vatican is recognizing Jerusalem as the undivided capital of the Jewish state. And so there was a lot of criticism leveled at the Vatican for implying that the Jews had control over the eastern half of the city, and the Vatican quickly responded by saying that it was just simply an economic matter and that they weren't getting caught up into the divide over, what land belongs to whom. But if you know anything about the holy sites here in this city, I mean, it's in many ways one of the leading sites or cities of three different world religions, huge religions: Christianity, the Jewish religion, and of course Islam. And if you know anything about the passions behind these three religions, you know that they're all angling for their holy sites. They all have a stake in Jerusalem, and you can be sure that Rome is very concerned about what's happening here in Jerusalem. It's an explosive mixture, to say the least. Now look here at Hosea chapter 5. Zechariah's prophecy that we just read is about to be fulfilled only because of this prophecy here in Hosea chapter 5 that is now happening. Really, in so many ways, it's already happened. Look at Hosea 5 now in verse 13. It says, "When Ephraim saw his sickness, and when Judah saw his wound, then went Ephraim to the Assyrian, and sent to King Jareb, yet could he not heal you, nor cure you of your wound." Now that wound, with respect to Judah, which is this little Israeli state, that wound, as we've said and explained so often before, is the Arab-Israeli peace process. Over the last 2 decades, the Arabs have used the peace process to undermine everything Israel is doing, and they're attempting to destroy Israel. It's plainly stated in all of their charters. They want to just wipe Israel off the map. And they're using this peace process to do that. We've seen it time and time again play out. Israel pulls back, lays down its arms, removes its people, keeps going back to the bargaining table, and what do they get in return? They get terrorists who continue pushing for greater gains through kidnappings, rocket attacks, suicide bombings, all of those things. And they're just going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until they're strong enough to liberate Jerusalem, the way the Arabs see it. They think that this is occupied territory, and that's why you have speeches like what you had in Egypt recently, where Morsi is talking about this being the eternal capital, and how that they want to send people here to either obtain it, to either capture it, or to die as martyrs doing so. Daniel chapter 11. Let's turn over to the book of Daniel, and we'll look at this prophecy I referred to at the start. Now, Israel may have a stronger, more unified government at the moment than it's had in many, many years, and it may even launch some kind of preemptive strike against Iran, but it certainly won't devastate the king of the south. We know that because of what the Bible says. What we also know is that because of Judah's wound, as we just read about from Hosea, Israel will eventually turn to the resurrected Holy Roman Empire in Europe for help. They go to the Assyrian, as Hosea says, but that's an arrangement or an alliance that will quickly backfire, and one that, just looking at history, Israel should have avoided altogether. In any event, look at Daniel 11 here in verse 40. It says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. God says there will be a clash in this end time between the kings of the north and south. These are the same two forces that were pitted against each other during the Crusades. You have the Catholic Europe and radical Islam here in the Middle East. History, in other words, is just repeating itself. The Bible says Islamic forces will aggressively push and push at Europe, not just against Israel here, but Europe as well. You can be sure that Europe is taking note of what's happening here in the Middle East, that Europe is well aware of Iran's nuclear program. The European Union will eventually retaliate and do so forcefully against this Islamic push. It'll do so like a whirlwind, as it brings out here in Daniel 11. An Iranian bomb is not a threat to Israel alone, as Netanyahu recently told Time magazine. It threatens Europe as well. And a German-led Europe will ultimately be the superpower that knocks out radical Islam, not Israel, but rather Europe. Notice verses 41 and 42 once again. It says, "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape." Note that. It says there that Egypt will not escape. So when this German-led European Union comes against the Iran-led Islamic Union here in the Middle East, Egypt will not escape the onslaught. Now, this is why, for nearly 2 decades now, we've been talking about when, not if, but when Egypt goes radical. And now it's happened just in the last year. And you'll recall at the beginning of last year that this was something that Western news agencies were very excited about, this democratic movement as they saw it, and were very, very quickly awakening to the fact that this is not a democratic uprising, it's rather a swing over to radicalism. Notice verse 41, just again, to bring out one more point. "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape," and so on and so forth. Notice again, though, this king of the north enters into the glorious land. That's this region right here around Jerusalem. So after responding to this Islamic push, this German-led European power will then enter into Jerusalem. And we don't have time to go into the Gospels there, where Jesus talked about the armies surrounding this city. We'll get to that perhaps at another time. But notice again in all of this how central Jerusalem is to these many prophecies. Carrying on here, verse 44 says, "But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many." So this is toward the end of the Great Tribulation, talked about in so many prophecies of the Bible. It's during that 5th trumpet blast referred to in the book of Revelation. And this is when the final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire will be troubled by events that happen in Asia. Tidings out of the east or the Orient and out of the north or Russia will worry the king of the north. And fearing an attack by these Asiatic hordes, this European beast power will unleash a preemptive strike against them. Now continue on in verse 45. "And he," speaking of the religious head of this Euro beast, "shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain." Now this verse refers to a religious leader who actually moves his headquarters, the tabernacles of his palace, as it says there in verse 45, to a holy mountain between 2 seas. That's speaking of the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And what it means is this Mount Zion, which is just adjacent to this old city, just south of it, the city of David, that will be the new headquarters for this religious head. But it's going to be a short-lived relocation. As I say, we don't have to get into, have time to get into all of these prophecies. Just to continue, verse 45 though, it says, "Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So as I say, it's a short-lived reign, and you could continue on. The vision continues really through the next few verses of Daniel chapter 12. It continues into it, and you can see how God's people factor right into all of these events, and it really puts things in the context of a countdown. That's what we're in the midst of right now, a countdown to the return of Jesus Christ. That's what all of these events are leading to, and that's why it is, as I said earlier, so exciting to see. Even though there's a lot of bad things that are going to be happening before Jesus Christ actually returns, it certainly does culminate in the greatest event that this world will have ever seen. Now, let me read to you, in conclusion here, what my father wrote in his booklet, Jerusalem and Prophecy. This is a booklet, by the way, that you need to request and study on your own time, because it goes into some of these prophecies we've covered here in today's episode, and it goes into them in much greater detail. But my father wrote in that booklet, he said, 3 great religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all have an intense interest in Jerusalem. He says that city is the 3rd most holy site to the Muslims. It's the most holy city for the Jews. And he says Christians consider it their 1st or 2nd holiest city. He writes, in the end, it's going to bring disaster to all 3 religions. Now let's conclude over in Zechariah again. Zechariah chapter 12, here in verse 3. Zechariah 12, just picking up one verse here. Verse 3 says, and in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Today, in this age of man, the civilization of man, today Jerusalem is certainly a burden. It's bitterly divided, as I said earlier, and soon it's going to be forcefully split in half. Every nation, in the end, that burdens itself with this city will, as the prophet said there, be cut in pieces. But God still has an intense interest in this city, much more so than any other city on earth, because this is the city that He has chosen. Zechariah wrote about that at the start of his book. This is the city that He's chosen from the very beginning to be the eternal capital of the whole world and ultimately the entire universe. This is Stephen Flurry speaking to you from outside the old city walls in Jerusalem.